today, Aber, I don't know if he can hear me. He went to the nursery. But he's been really on me lately, so the kids, every time there's a little scuffle or something in the house, they're always like, Dad, you got to put this in your message, Dad. You got to tell him. And Aber's been telling me every week, Dad, you haven't used the illustration of when Job shot me in the eye with vinegar. Because they have these bathroom jobs they're supposed to do, so they each have their own bottle of vinegar for cleaning their own bathroom, and apparently, quite a ways back, I don't know. Apparently, Job shot Aber in the eye with the vinegar in a dispute. So let's remember not to do that. Abraham was like, Dad, don't forget today. You've got to. You've never talked about it. We'll assume that it was an accident for now until proven guilty. So, anyway, today we're looking at two different things, and two different things that are really one thing. And maybe you won't realize they're one thing for a while. But we're going to be in Galatians chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at food laws and socializing with non-Jewish people laws. And I think you're going to see that law of what you should and shouldn't eat and who you should and shouldn't visit are essentially very close to being one and the same law. So what about food laws? Old Testament laws. I said last week that I thought it may be important to, I'm not so sure that you should eat things with blood in it, or eat the blood. That's something that I kind of wonder about. So what about all these other food laws? Unclean foods, what about them? What do you know? I would be extremely curious to see what you guys knew about it, or if someone were to tell you, you should not eat unclean meat or unclean foods, what would you think? Would you be easily convinced of that? What do you eat? What do you know about it? And this is why I say, this is why it's important to bring it up before you get faced with something where you're like, I don't know. So if you were to look at Isaiah 66:17, the Lord is talking about people who are washing themselves, purifying themselves, making themselves holy. And it says here in the end of 17, it says, but they follow after others, eating pig's flesh and abomination and mice. But he says, but they will all be destroyed together. So you're like, whew, before I eat pork and I am destroyed along with all the rest of the wicked, maybe I should think about this. So what if you're like, what if once again, what if I was hit by a bus? And somebody walked in here tomorrow and was like, you know what, just to be on the safe side, I wouldn't do that. I mean, is that good or bad? Or what if I ask you this question, can it become wrong to do something that was commanded as right in the Old Testament? So as you're looking at this, that's a serious thing to think about. And why would you, or why couldn't you, or what is the reason for it? Why did it begin, and why wouldn't you be able to now? So today we're looking at here in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 11. And so right before we get into this whole socializing with non-Jewish people and the foods they eat, I want to point out one little thing, and that is that Paul, remember his huge defense of how, he is an apostle who definitely understands everything for the non-Jewish church. He is someone who's saying, listen, I've got this message and word from God, right? And he is somebody who is exercising his authority and saying, listen, don't doubt me and put me below the rest of the apostles. And there's one little thing I want to point out just as we're going through this, and that is that if there was an apostle that was above Paul, it would probably be Peter. Peter was the leader of the apostles in many, many ways. He always seems to be one making decisions. He is first in every list of the apostles. I don't think it's alphabetical Hebrew or Greek or anything like that. It's just he seems to be the leader of them. So if Paul was to prove himself equality in knowledge, it would be probably up against Peter. So listen to this, what he says here in verse 11. He says, but when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. He says, when Peter came to Antioch, he's like, I went right in his face and set him straight. And you're like, oh, I can't help but think that Paul is maybe saying a little bit of what Peter was doing wrong, along with the fact that, listen, I have this knowledge from God, and the other apostles aren't going to be above me, and it's not like I'm lacking some knowledge. It's not like I'm somehow below them. He says, I came right up in Peter's face, and I was like, Peter, you're in the wrong, Peter. And that's very interesting that Paul would have the ability to exercise authority like that. So what did Peter do wrong? What was he doing that he shouldn't have been doing? It says that he stood condemned. He stood in the wrong, and Paul is telling him, straighten up. And it says in verse 12, it says that before certain men came from James, Peter was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So Peter, and we looked at this part already, but Peter stepped back and he was like, I'm not eating with them. And Paul gets right in his face, and he's like, Peter, you're in the wrong right now. What you're doing is wrong. How you're acting is wrong. He says, you are in the wrong. And so one other point is that some people say that these men came from James. And some people say these men came from James, and I've literally heard it like this, okay? Some people say these men came from James and told Peter, you should never have been eating with the non-Jewish people. You shouldn't have been associating with it. And they say that really Peter was the one in the right, and Paul was saying, Peter, why did you ever go and associate with the non-Jewish people? They're saying that Peter was the one in the right. But it says that the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with Peter. And it says that so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Paul says, listen, when they were acting like, oh, it's still wrong to eat with the Gentiles. It's still wrong to be around them. Paul says, do you realize that Peter was literally leading believers astray by saying what was once commanded for us to do, what was right for us to do in the Old Testament, when he pretended that it was still right to do now, he was leading believers astray. He was leading them to think that something was still in effect that was no longer in effect, and that was wrong. He was acting hypocritically. He was acting in hypocrisy that was leading people astray by pretending for the sake of others that he should not have anything to do with that sort of thing. And it was something that was wrong to do. Now, you could argue the fact, you could say, okay, maybe Peter was with the non-Jewish people, but maybe he was eating their food, but he was avoiding all the unclean foods that they would eat. And you could make that case. I'm not saying you couldn't, but I'm going to say this. You're going to see that eating with them and associating with them is really very much the exact same law. It's both, the law came together as one thing, that you don't eat their food and you don't socialize with them. So as we go on here, it says that Paul says this in verse 14. He says, when I saw, so Paul walks in, Peter's pretending that he was never eating their food, never sitting with them, never socializing with them. And Paul walks in and he says this, when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, he says, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, he says, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? He says, listen, Peter, I know how you live. You live like one of them, free from Old Testament law. That's how you live when these guys aren't here. And he says, now, in your hypocrisy, you're pretending you don't. Now, what would that say? That would say that Peter had a full understanding that they were no longer under these things. And he's saying, and I know that I've heard a lot of people say, oh, flip this around. Let's say that Paul is saying, listen, Peter, you know that you should never do those things. But in my mind, it's quite obvious that they were acting in hypocrisy, that Paul said what they were doing when they separated, they were in the wrong, because they were previously living just like the non-Jewish people. So it says here that they're eating and drinking with the Gentiles, or they're eating with the Gentiles. And so Paul is saying this is what he got in Peter's face about, forcing non-Jewish people to go back under those restrictions and laws. He says, by pretending that you are still living under Old Testament things, You are putting a forceful feeling upon this church that are making even Barnabas walk away from the truth of what the gospel brought to us and start acting like he as well is still under these restrictions. So as we look at this, what about this unclean food? I think that you're going to see that this unclean food relates to this scenario a little more than you might see at first glance. What about eating unclean food? Why would you eat it now? I've heard this argument before. When Noah was getting on the ark, before Mosaic law, okay? Before Mosaic law, when Noah's getting on the ark, what did God say? He said, take the clean and the unclean animals. So if there was unclean animals before the children of Israel came along and the law not to eat them, they say, well, if they were unclean then, they should never be eaten because they were unclean before the law even came, so you should never eat an unclean animal. I've heard this argument, and that's a pretty interesting argument. So I would ask you this. Could they eat unclean animals before the flood? No, they couldn't. Could they eat clean animals before the flood? No, they couldn't. Before the flood, they were commanded not to eat any animals. They could only eat green plants and fruit with seeds in it. That was all they could eat. I don't know how many fruits don't have seeds in them, but I would assume maybe the tree of knowledge and good and evil wouldn't want it spreading all over the place. I don't know. But that was all they could eat. And so when you look at this, they're taking clean and unclean animals onto the ark. What are the clean animals? Clean animals are mixed in with the unclean animals. The only difference is they can pull out a clean animal and sacrifice it. It is worthy of sacrifice, but they are not separated. They're not commanded not to touch them. They're not supposed to eat any of them, clean or unclean. It's just that they are fit as a sacrifice to God. So it says here in Genesis chapter 9, it says that they're getting off of the ark. And this is what God says to Noah and his family. He says in verse 2, he says, from now on, I'm going to put a fear of man in the animals. In every fish and beast, they are going to be in fear of humans. Before they got off, there was no fear of man. Why? They weren't going to eat them. They weren't a predator. People say, over millions of years, they developed the ability to know that humans are dangerous because they'd been hunted. Well, God knew who would be hunted, and he says, I'm going to install a fear system in them. From now on, you're going to have to catch the animals that you're going to eat. He says, I'm going to put fear into these animals. Why? Because all of a sudden, they're about to be food. And he says in verse 2, every moving thing that creeps upon the earth shall be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you every single thing that moves upon the earth can be food for you now. From now on, I don't care if it's clean. I don't care if it's unclean. I don't care if it creeps or crawls, runs or hops. Every single one of them, from now on, eat it. Go ahead. All of them, every one of them will be food for you from now on. He says, I give them everything that crawls or creeps or moves is yours to be eaten. So, but he says, now they're going to have a fear of man. So when did it come along that they weren't supposed to eat them? When did this happen, that they weren't supposed to eat them? In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 24, he says, I, the Lord, your God, who has separated you from the other peoples. So God says to the Jewish people, here we come along, we've had all the animals to be eaten. And now God says, listen, Jewish people, I have chosen you to be my people. You and you alone are clean upon the earth. In fact, we as non-Jews fall under the unclean animals. We are not even to be touched. Only the Jewish people alone are God's chosen people at this point. He says, I have chosen you from amongst all of the peoples. And then he says this, because of that, and that's very important, for this reason, this is the reason. I've heard people preach messages and they say, the reason they weren't supposed to eat unclean meat was because all of these animals carried diseases. Did we carry diseases? That's never taught. That's never said. There's nothing of that. In fact, God says, listen, for this reason, because I have cut you out from amongst all the peoples as a clean people, as my people, he says, for that reason, separate the clean beasts now from the unclean beasts, and the clean birds from the unclean birds, for this reason. And he repeats it again. He says, I don't even want you to touch the unclean animals anymore. For this reason, because I have set you apart as a clean people. This will be the sign. As you separate the clean from the unclean, and you are separate from all of the other people on the face of the earth. So I want you, for that reason, to separate animals as a picture of that. The clean and the unclean are now divided, and you and all the rest of the people on earth are now divided. That's the purpose of giving this law to you. So you would say, all right, well, in the New Testament, so let's say in the Old Testament, if you wanted to become a follower of God, you may have to be circumcised and enter into Judaism and Jewish things and this sort of thing. It's kind of complicated. But let's say in the New Testament, if God has made all people his people, and those who are not his people have been called his people, if we who were two peoples, God has made one people, wouldn't you think that God would say, eat the unclean meat, and reverse that sign? Wouldn't that make perfect sense, that the sign that represented that God only chooses one people, that he would need to erase it? Wouldn't that make perfect sense, that maybe he would even command us to eat the unclean animals? Listen to this here in Acts 10:10. It said, Peter became hungry, and while he was waiting for the food to be prepared, he fell into a trance. It says he fell into this deep sleep. And it says, and he saw the heavens open, and he said, behold, what was like a great sheet descending by its four corners upon the earth. And he said, in it were every kind of animal and creeping thing. And he said, a voice came to him from heaven, and he said, rise, Peter, kill and eat. So God says, listen, Peter, I'm laying before you all of these unclean animals. And I'm not just suggesting, I'm telling you, eat them. And this is interesting because Peter would be like, well, what? That would mean two things. That would mean that now all people are acceptable to God, number one. And number two, it would mean that he was supposed to do something that he wasn't supposed to do in the Old Testament. And then Peter says, but Lord, by no means. I've never eaten anything that was common or unclean. Peter says, no, I won't. And God says, oh, yes, you will. God says to him, a voice came to him the second time and said, rise, Peter, kill and eat. What I have made clean, do not call unclean. God says, I am telling you, I made this clean. Don't tell me it's not clean. And so, what would Peter learn from that? If God was like, listen, eat unclean animals, what should Peter assume from this? He should probably assume that every human on earth is now clean because God has reversed the sign of the separation. So listen to what Peter says in Acts 10:28. It says, Peter said to the other Jews, he says, brothers, you know how unlawful it was, or is, for us to associate or even visit someone from another people group. But he says, God has shown me that I should call no human common or unclean. He says, when God told me to eat the thing that he told us to separate when he made us separate, he says, I know for a fact now that God accepts every single person on earth. That God has made the animals clean, that God has made the people clean, because they are one and the same sign that we are supposed to do. And lastly, I just want to point out in Mark 7:18, it says that Jesus is talking to people, and he says to them, he says, are you also without understanding? He says, do you not understand that whatever goes into the body does not defile a man, because it does not enter his heart, but it enters his stomach and is expelled? And then he says, by this he declared all meats clean. So Jesus is just giving this common illustration, and all of a sudden Mark says Jesus was telling them, from now on, every meat is clean. And some versions say all food's clean, but I've looked this up in the Greek, and the primary word for this to me is meat. And either way, if he says all foods are clean and he declares them clean, then they are clean. And it was for a reason. So in closing this morning, as we think about this and you think about, what should I do? Or what if I'm faced with unclean meat? What should my response be? And I would say that, as Paul says, if I'm going to offend somebody by the meat I eat, then I won't eat it. But what about if we were to flip the script? What about if you were to go into a believer's home who is confident that they should eat unclean food. And you said to them, I will not eat that. That is unclean. What two things are you saying? You're saying no, and this is in my conscience, okay? This is how I view it. I hate giving my own opinion. You know I try to stick directly to the Word of God and not give you my opinion, but this is my opinion of my conscience on it, okay? If I were to say to someone, I won't eat pork, that's an unclean thing. I would be telling them two things that I believe in my mind are a lie. Number one, you are not clean. God has not made you acceptable. There is a divide in the peoples. And two, in order for you to be clean, you must fall back to the Old Testament laws yourself. Because I obviously am standing on an Old Testament law to make myself good. So now I'm putting pressure upon you to do the same. And I believe this is in large part what Peter did. Remember what Peter did? He pretended he was under Old Testament laws, and he began to lead people astray from the truth of the gospel. And Paul says you need to understand the truth of the gospel, and this is not how you teach people the truth of the gospel. So in my mind, that's how I look at it, is that if God made it clean, and you say it's not clean and you avoid it, you have to be careful what crowd you're in. If you're avoiding it for a diet, that's fine. If you're avoiding it not to offend anybody, that's fine. But if you're pretending that you're underneath those things, in my mind, you're leading people to believe things that are no longer supposed to be for us. And that's how I view this through the Scripture, the way I read it. So let's close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, we just thank you that you have made us clean, that you have made us acceptable to you, that you have made us your people, Lord, and we just thank you for that. We just thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, and his death for us, how he has redeemed us and purified us and cleaned us. I just pray that you just help us to correctly interpret your word and understand the reasons behind the things that we do and the things that we teach, Lord. And I just pray that your Spirit would always be guiding us in truth and what is right. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.